In the frozen stillness of Montana's wilderness, a battered bobcat fought her way back from the edge of death, carrying a secret that would leave even the toughest vet shaking with tears. When Willow, frail and scarred, gave birth to her 5 tiny cubs, no one expected what would come next. What Samuel Hayes discovered in that delivery room would unravel a mystery stretching far beyond one mother's struggle, and forge a bond between man and wild that no force could ever break. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about a love so fierce, it changed the world. Before we dive into this incredible journey, make sure to like this video and comment below where you're watching from. We love hearing your stories too. The wind tore across the Montana wilderness like an invisible whip, howling through the skeletal trees and scattering icy needles across the frozen earth. Dr. Samuel Hayes tightened his coat against the cold, his boots crunching deep into the half-frozen mud as he scanned the abandoned logging road ahead. When you spend enough time in the wild, you learn to listen beyond the noise, to hear the whispers of something wrong. And tonight, the forest was screaming it. His truck's headlights caught a flash of movement by the creek, small, trembling, and barely holding together. Samuel's heart clenched. It wasn't just any animal fighting against the storm. It was a bobcat, heavily pregnant, barely clinging to life. She was a ghost of the fierce predators he'd studied his entire life. Ribs jutting out painfully, her patchy fur matted with dirt and old scars that told stories of battles no one had witnessed. She stood, or rather staggered, her wild amber eyes locking onto Samuel's with a kind of exhausted defiance that almost made him step back. For a second, he wondered how she was even still alive. A brutal winter storm at her back, predators circling the woods unseen, and the cruel ticking clock of labor drawing near. Nature wasn't offering her mercy tonight, but maybe he could. Samuel moved slowly, whispering nonsense under his breath like a man trying to tame a ghost. Every step closer felt like a negotiation. She didn't snarl. She didn't run. Maybe she already knew there was nowhere left to go. With a practiced hand and a soft, weighted net, Samuel scooped her up. She barely resisted. Her body was alarmingly cold, her breathing shallow. As he cradled her against him, he realized just how close to the edge she really was. It wasn't just her life at stake anymore. She was carrying more than her own survival. The snow thickened, painting the woods into a suffocating blur of white. Samuel wasted no time, loading her gently into the back of his truck, securing her into a lined carrier with trembling fingers. As he slammed the door shut, he caught one last glimpse of her through the metal grate. She wasn't looking at him with fear. It was something deeper, something ancient, a silent plea across the species divide. Save them. The drive back to Pine Hollow Wildlife Sanctuary was a test of nerves. The back roads were barely visible under the crushing storm, and every gust of wind threatened to shove his truck into the endless black. But Samuel clutched the steering wheel like a lifeline, heart pounding in rhythm with the storm outside. Behind him, the bobcat whimpered softly. It was the kind of sound that twisted inside you, a reminder that the wild wasn't cruel, it was simply indifferent. Survival belonged to the stubborn, the scarred, and the lucky. And tonight, he swore, this battered mother would not be left to fate. Arriving at the sanctuary felt like reaching a lighthouse in a shipwreck. Claire Donovan, his assistant and perhaps the only person crazier than Samuel about saving lost creatures, threw open the doors. Her face shifted from confusion to horror as she saw the limp form Samuel carried in. Without a word, they moved, rehearsed and desperate. Every second mattered now. As they rushed through the dim-lit halls toward the treatment room, Samuel's mind raced. There were so many unknowns. How far along was she? How many cubs? Were they even alive? They didn't have time for questions. Only action. Samuel placed her carefully on the padded table, feeling the tremors racking her body. Claire prepped 4 fluids, warming blankets, and oxygen while Samuel monitored her vitals, muttering encouragements she couldn't possibly understand but somehow needed to hear. They were not just fighting for one life tonight. They were fighting for a future that had almost been lost to the cold. As Willow's breathing grew shallower, Samuel leaned in, feeling an almost sacred connection pull tight between them. She was more than a patient. She was a symbol, of resilience, of wild, stubborn hope, and maybe, just maybe, of something that could still be saved if they fought hard enough. A storm may have brought them together, but what came next would test everything they believed about survival and about love. And just like that, with a single shuddering breath, the fight for life truly began. The air inside Pine Hollow Sanctuary was thick with the scent of antiseptic and raw urgency. Claire barely had time to throw her coat on the hook before she was elbow-deep in prepping the operating room. The Bobcat, who Samuel had silently named Willow in his mind, lay barely conscious on the padded table. Every so often, a tremor would ripple through her thin body, a grim reminder that time wasn't on their side. Labor had already started, and it wasn't going to wait for a more convenient moment. Nature, as usual, had zero regard for human schedules. Samuel snapped on a pair of gloves and leaned in, listening to Willow's ragged breathing. Her body was trying to bring new life into the world while barely holding on to her own. It wasn't just risky, it was a miracle that she'd made it this far at all. Claire handed him the ultrasound wand with a tight nod, and together they moved like a machine fueled by silent, frantic hope. On the tiny screen, the flicker of tiny heartbeats danced like distant stars in a storm. 5 cubs. 5 tiny reasons not to give up. The first contraction hit hard, and Willow's body convulsed weakly. Samuel steadied her, whispering encouragements as if words alone could summon strength. Minutes dragged by like hours. Then finally, the first cub emerged, tiny, fragile, but breathing. Samuel worked quickly, clearing its nose and wrapping it gently in a warmed cloth. Claire smiled through tears. Against every odds stacked against them, life had arrived. But fate, true to form, wasn't going to make the rest easy. The second cub came next, smaller and slower, but still breathing. Samuel placed it alongside its sibling in a heated incubator Claire had rigged up in a rush. For a moment, a fragile hope floated in the room, hanging between heartbeats. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. And then Willow stiffened again and the third cub arrived. Samuel's hands froze midair. What lay before him wasn't like the others. This cub's fur shimmered an eerie silver under the harsh fluorescent lights, its tiny back legs twisted unnaturally inward, a deformity so rare Samuel had only read about it in dusty veterinary journals. Claire gasped behind him, a hand flying to her mouth. It wasn't just the deformity. There was something else, something darker, something wrong that prickled at the edges of Samuel's mind like a warning. As he lifted the cub gently, his fingers brushed against Willow's abdomen, and he felt it. Raised, rough scars, almost invisible against her thinning fur. Marks left by fire. Branding. Someone had done this. Someone had hurt her so deeply it had bled into the lives she was trying to bring into this world. The fourth and fifth cubs followed, each carrying small, heartbreaking marks of their mother's pain. One with a missing ear tip, another with a strange pattern across its back that didn't belong in nature. Samuel fought back the hot sting behind his eyes. Willow hadn't just survived a brutal winter. She had survived human cruelty, unspeakable violence, and yet here she was, fighting to give her cubs a chance in a world that had tried to crush her. Samuel bundled the silver cub in another cloth, cradling it against his chest as if proximity alone could protect it. Claire moved quietly around him, checking vitals, adjusting oxygen, her face set in a determined, tear-streaked mask. Together, they built a tiny universe around Willow and her cubs, a shield against the outside world that had already asked too much from them. As Willow's breathing slowed into a fitful sleep, Samuel sat beside her, one hand resting gently against her side. His mind whirled with questions, with rage, with sorrow. Who had done this? Why? And how many others like Willow were still out there, fighting battles no one ever saw? But under the fury was something stronger, a fierce, unyielding promise. They would not let her down. Because sometimes, in the darkest corners of the world, survival wasn't just about clawing your way through another day. It was about fighting for something bigger, for family, for love, for the simple, staggering right to exist. And tonight, under the flickering lights of a battered sanctuary, love was winning. The storm outside raged like a wild, living thing, battering the sanctuary's old windows as if it, too, wanted to witness what had just unfolded inside. Samuel sat motionless, the silver-furred cub cradled in his palms like a fragile piece of some ancient magic. Claire hovered nearby, her eyes flickering between the newborns and Willow, whose breath now came in slow, exhausted sighs. No words were spoken. There was no need. The silence itself throbbed with disbelief, grief, and a fragile spark of wonder that no one dared touch yet. The tiny cub in Samuel's hands was a contradiction in itself. Its body was so delicate it looked like it might vanish if he blinked too hard. Yet the defiant flutter of its heartbeat against his skin was a roaring declaration. I am here. The silvery sheen of its fur caught the harsh fluorescent lights, turning the little body into something almost otherworldly. But it wasn't just the strange color or the twisted back legs that made Samuel's chest ache. It was the thought of everything this tiny creature had endured before it even drew its first breath. A story of survival written into every hair, every tiny claw. Claire finally broke the silence with a whisper so soft it barely made it across the room. What happened to her? Samuel shook his head slowly, the weight of it pulling at his shoulders. Someone tried to play God, he muttered, voice rough like gravel. And Willow paid the price. He moved carefully to place the silver cub alongside its siblings in the warmed incubator. But the moment he set it down, Willow stirred. Weak and trembling, she dragged herself across the padded table, inch by agonizing inch, until she could nuzzle the cubs close with her battered nose. It wasn't instinct. It was something deeper, something raw and ancient that clawed past the pain. A mother's love that refused to surrender. Samuel and Claire watched, hearts splintering in their chests, as Willow curled her fragile body protectively around her newborns. There was nothing passive about it. It was a warrior's shield, battered but unbreakable. She might have been scarred, twisted by cruelty, but she would not let them be taken from her. Claire wiped a tear roughly from her cheek, trying to hide it behind a fake cough. We need to run a full panel on her, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Genetic damage, infections, trauma markers, and we need to do it fast. Samuel nodded, already pulling supplies toward them, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere darker. The scars, the mutations. It wasn't random. Somewhere, someone had done this on purpose. And if Willow was here, half dead and still fighting, there might be others out there still lost in the dark. As they worked, Samuel caught glimpses of his own past bleeding through the present. Flashes of smoke-choked forests, burned cages, animals who had once trusted humans staring back at him with horror before vanishing into the flames. He had failed them once, failed to save them from the worst side of humanity. But Willow was his second chance, his battle to fight and win no matter the cost. Hours passed like a dream stitched together with fear and hope. Each test they ran confirmed it. Genetic tampering, branding marks, signs of trauma no wild creature should ever bear. Willow's cubs weren't just victims. They were living evidence. Evidence someone out there would not want found. As Samuel bandaged Willow's battered side with hands more tender than he even knew he had, he leaned in close and whispered, I don't know what you went through. I don't know who hurt you. But I swear on everything I have left, they won't get to you again. Willow's tired eyes cracked open for a moment, and in that gaze was something that hit harder than any blow Samuel had ever taken. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was trust. Wounded, tentative, but real. And in that moment, as the storm pounded against the sanctuary walls and new life huddled against old pain, a new battle line was drawn. They were no longer just survivors. They were a family, and they were ready to fight for every heartbeat. The world outside had frozen into silence, a sharp contrast to the battle that had raged within the sanctuary walls all night. Samuel sat hunched over the desk in his cramped office, the glow of a single lamp pooling over scattered files, dog-eared folders, and a laptop that buzzed and whirred like it might give up at any second. But giving up wasn't an option tonight. Not after what he'd seen. Not after Willow. His fingers tapped a frantic rhythm against the desk as he combed through case reports, old news articles, and incident logs buried so deep in state records that most people would have assumed they were long forgotten. And maybe they were supposed to be forgotten. The more Samuel dug, the colder the pit in his stomach grew. There it was, hidden under layers of bureaucracy and deliberate misfiling. A series of reports from years ago about illegal wildlife breeding operations scattered across the country. Specialized rings focused on creating exotic mutations, silver coats, unique markings, traits that shouldn't exist outside fantasy books, traits that sold for unthinkable prices to private collectors with more money than soul. He leaned back, staring at the names and locations scrawled across his notes. Somewhere in those ugly shadows, Willow's story had begun. Somewhere in the greed and cruelty, her tiny cubs had been written into existence. Not out of love, not out of survival, but out of profit. A lump rose in his throat, bitter and heavy. He thought he had left that world behind years ago, after one mission too many ended in smoke and failure. He thought he had done enough by walking away. But the past had a nasty habit of dragging you back in, just when you least expected it. A soft cry broke the heavy silence, pulling Samuel back to the present. He hurried down the hall, heart pounding, finding Willow still weak but fiercely upright in her enclosure. She was nuzzling each cub one by one, her movements tender and trembling. Samuel crouched beside her, watching, feeling that sharp stab of awe hit him all over again. Against everything, against monsters seen and unseen, this mother had fought her way to this moment. Not for herself, for them. Claire slipped into the room quietly, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She handed one to Samuel, her eyes dark with questions she didn't have to ask. He took a sip, grimacing at the bitterness, but grateful for the jolt. They needed every ounce of energy they could muster, because this wasn't over. Not even close. "What do we do now?" Claire whispered. Samuel didn't answer right away. He watched Willow stretch her battered body protectively over the cubs, her sides heaving with effort. There was no hesitation in her, no second-guessing, just raw, unbreakable instinct to protect what mattered most. He turned back to Claire, voice steady as bedrock. "We make sure they're safe, no matter what it takes." The conviction in his words settled over them like armor. They weren't just fighting to save a litter of bobcats. They were fighting to mend a broken chain of trust between the wild and the world that had tried to tame it. Every heartbeat in that room carried the weight of something bigger than themselves. But even as Samuel laid plans in his mind, expanded enclosures, stricter patrols, anonymous tips to authorities he half-trusted, a cold sensation pricked at the edges of his awareness. They weren't alone in this. Someone somewhere knew Willow had survived, knew the cubs existed. And if there was one thing Samuel had learned the hard way, it was that when secrets started slipping through cracks, the wrong people always came looking. Outside, the storm had finally started to break, the winds dying into a heavy, ominous quiet. Samuel watched the first stars peek through the tattered clouds, their faint light barely touching the world below. Hope, stubborn and reckless, refused to be buried. But hope alone wasn't enough. Not when monsters wore human faces. The past had whispered its warnings. Now it was only a matter of time before the real fight began. And Samuel was ready, because this time he wasn't just saving animals. He was saving family. The days that followed blurred together, stitched tight with equal parts hope and exhaustion. Willow's strength, to Samuel's amazement, clawed its way back faster than he could have predicted. She still bore the weight of her scars, inside and out, but every morning she was up, guarding her cubs, nudging them with soft growls when they wandered too far in the nursery pen Claire had built. Life was blooming again inside Pine Hollow. For the first time in a long time, Samuel dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had won this quiet war. But the world outside hadn't forgotten. Started small. A strange pickup parked at the far edge of the sanctuary's property line, lingering just long enough to be noticed but not long enough to be caught. Samuel brushed it off at first. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe a curious local. Pine Hollow wasn't exactly the beating heart of Montana's tourist scene, but still, people got turned around out here. It happened, except it didn't stop. 2 days later, Claire found a set of fresh boot prints in the mud just past the south fence. Too big to be Samuel's. Too deep to be a casual wanderer. Someone had come looking, and they had gotten close. Too close. Samuel's gut twisted into knots. Every instinct he had, every ounce of hard-earned experience from years spent cleaning up other people's messes, told him one thing: trouble was circling. He tried to keep the tension out of his voice when he talked to Claire, but it was like trying to hide smoke from a wildfire. "We keep the cubs inside," he said firmly. "We double the rounds. No one comes in without clearance." Claire nodded, but the worry in her eyes mirrored his own. They both knew that when people like the ones who hurt Willow wanted something back, they didn't knock politely. They took. That night, Samuel sat on the porch of the main cabin, a mug of coffee cradled between his hands, his old service pistol resting quietly on the table beside him. The moon cut silver across the landscape, turning the sanctuary into a world half made of dreams and half of nightmares. He listened to the night sounds: frogs chirping at the creek, the distant rustle of deer in the brush, and waited. Hours passed. Nothing. And then headlights. 2 beams sliced through the trees, slow and searching. Samuel's heart slammed against his ribs. He moved fast, cutting the outdoor lights and slipping into the shadows. The truck, a nondescript model caked in dirt, rolled to a stop just outside the sanctuary gate. No plates, no markings, just 2 silhouettes sitting in the cab, waiting, watching. Samuel stayed low, barely breathing. Whoever they were, they knew what they were looking for, and they weren't planning to leave without it. After a tense, endless moment, the truck reversed and pulled away, tires spinning up loose gravel. They didn't try to breach the gate. Not tonight. Maybe they were scouting. Maybe they were waiting for a softer moment. But they would be back. Samuel knew it like he knew the sun would rise. The next morning, Claire found a note pinned to the sanctuary gate. No threats, no demands, just 2 words, scratched in an ugly, jagged hand: "She's ours." Samuel stood there for a long moment, the paper fluttering in his grip. Cold fury ignited in his chest, hotter than any fear could touch. Willow, this broken, beautiful soul who had clawed her way back from hell, was not property. She was not a prize. She was a mother, a fighter, a survivor. And they would have to burn this sanctuary to the ground before they laid a single hand on her or her cubs. He crumpled the note in his fist and turned to Claire, his voice low and final. "It's time to disappear, because sometimes survival wasn't about standing your ground. Sometimes survival was about vanishing so well, the monsters looking for you spent the rest of their lives chasing ghosts." Samuel didn't waste a second. Plans that had only ever existed in the back of his mind slammed into action with a clarity that came from pure survival instinct. Claire gathered supplies: emergency food, medical kits, fuel cans, while Samuel prepped the old truck hidden behind the sanctuary's barn. They packed light but smart. Every second counted now. The night air was thick with an electric tension, the kind you feel in your bones before the first crack of a coming storm. Somewhere out there, in the dark, predators far more dangerous than any wolf or cougar were already moving. Inside the nursery, Willow paced, her golden eyes sharp and restless. She could sense it. Animals always could. Samuel knelt by her, heart breaking all over again at the strength stitched into her battered frame. He gently lifted the cubs into a crate lined with thick blankets, the silver-furred one mewling softly as he adjusted them for the long ride ahead. Willow followed every move with hawk-like focus, and when Samuel finally latched the carrier, she pressed her nose against it, letting out a low, almost mournful whimper. "We're not leaving you behind," Samuel whispered, looping a heavy blanket around her trembling body. "You're coming too." The sanctuary's back gate creaked open into the sprawling woods beyond. Samuel floored the gas pedal, the old truck fishtailing on the icy gravel before catching grip and lunging forward. Behind them, Pine Hollow disappeared into the misty darkness, a home abandoned but not forgotten. They weren't running out of fear. They were running out of love. Headlights tore through the forest behind them minutes later. Claire cursed under her breath, tightening her grip on the carrier, her knuckles whitening. Samuel pushed the truck harder, dodging fallen branches and deep potholes like a man who knew these woods better than his own heartbeat. The cubs whimpered and cried, the jostling jarring them awake, but Willow, pressed against Claire's side, stayed unervingly still, her muscles taut like a coiled spring. A bend in the road loomed ahead, a sharp drop-off to the right and a narrow pass between two massive rock faces. Samuel didn't slow. There was no time. He veered onto a barely there hunting trail, the tires chewing up dirt and ice, the truck lurching like a ship in a hurricane. Behind them, the pursuing vehicle tried to follow and failed. The sickening crunch of metal and the scream of tires ripping into a ditch echoed through the trees, but Samuel didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Minutes blurred into hours as they pushed deeper into the heart of the wilderness. They crossed shallow streams, wound through towering pine groves, and climbed rocky paths that barely deserved to be called roads. Every mile that passed put another wall between them and the nightmare clawing at their heels. Finally, just as the first blush of dawn kissed the edges of the horizon, Samuel pulled the truck to a grinding halt beside a long-forgotten ranger station buried in the hills. The building sagged with years of abandonment, windows boarded up, the roof sagging under a heavy blanket of snow. It was perfect. Samuel and Claire moved quickly, hauling supplies inside, setting up heat lamps for the cubs, crafting makeshift beds from old ranger gear. Willow, weak but stubborn, followed every step, refusing to leave her babies even for a second. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but her spirit, her fire, was unbreakable. Finally, when the last crate was dragged through the warped doorway and the truck hidden beneath a thicket of frozen brush, Samuel slumped against the wall, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a sledgehammer. His hands shook uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief that they had made it. For now, Claire collapsed beside him, laughing breathlessly. "We're insane," she said. "You know that, right?" Samuel let out a hoarse chuckle, the sound half laughter, half sob. "Takes one to save one." Across the room, Willow lay curled around her cubs, her body battered, her soul unbeaten. She lifted her head for a moment, meeting Samuel's gaze with a look so fierce, so deeply rooted in a love bigger than pain, that he felt it carve a permanent mark into him. They had run through fire, through fear, through the teeth of the unknown. And together they had survived. But Samuel knew survival was only the first step. Now they had to rebuild something no storm could ever tear down again. Family. The abandoned ranger station wasn't much, but to Samuel, Claire, Willow, and her cubs, it was the safest fortress in the world. Hidden deep within a forgotten valley, draped in morning mist and guarded by the dense arms of the old-growth forest, it was a secret stitched into the landscape itself. Samuel spent the first day patching up the broken windows, setting up traps to alert them if anyone came too close, and reinforcing the doors with scrap lumber scavenged from the nearby woods. Every hammer strike felt like a heartbeat, pounding out a single message: "You are safe here." Inside, life slowly began to unfurl its battered wings. Willow, now free from the fear of pursuit, transformed before their eyes. She moved with more confidence, her steps less labored, her instincts sharper. She taught her cubs how to stalk imaginary prey around the dusty cabin, how to pounce on each other with tiny, clumsy paws, how to stretch toward the light filtering through cracked wooden boards. Watching her was like witnessing a phoenix rise from ashes no one had believed could burn any hotter. Samuel marveled at it, the sheer, raw resilience blooming right in front of him. And in those moments, while repairing the battered outpost or cleaning up after the cubs' latest messy adventure, he caught glimpses of something he thought he'd lost a long time ago: laughter. Not the hollow, brittle kind he'd gotten used to after too many years carrying invisible scars, but real, chest-shaking, eye-watering laughter. Claire, tough as iron and twice as stubborn, built a nursery out of stacked supply crates and old ranger bedding. They rigged up a makeshift kitchen, cooked meals over a scavenged propane stove, and filled the crumbling station with the smells of warm bread, wild game, and hope. Every corner that had once echoed with emptiness now pulsed with the messy, chaotic, beautiful noise of life. But even in paradise, shadows had a way of stretching. Some nights, Samuel would wake to the soft sound of Willow growling low in her throat, standing between the sleeping cubs and the door. He would lay there, listening, heart hammering, eyes scanning the darkness for threats he couldn't see but could feel slithering just beyond the tree line. No headlights had pierced the woods. No boot prints had marred the soft dirt around the station. But the knowledge was always there, tucked under the comfort like a knife under a pillow. They were still being hunted. One night, as the first hints of summer green crept into the valley, Samuel sat outside under the stars, feeling the heavy weight of everything pressing against him. Claire joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. They sat in silence for a long while, watching the sky spin its quiet miracles above them. "You ever think we're crazy for doing this?" Claire finally asked, a smile twitching at the corner of her mouth. Samuel snorted. Every minute of every day. And yet, neither of them would have chosen differently. Because somewhere along the way, this ragtag collection of broken things, an old ranger station, a battered bobcat mother, 5 imperfect cubs, 2 weary humans, had stitched itself together into something unstoppable. Family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes, family was the ones who showed up when the world turned its back. The ones who stayed when staying meant risking everything. The ones who looked at your scars and saw not something broken, but something sacred. Willow's silver cub, now named Ash for the color of resilience, climbed awkwardly onto Samuel's boot, letting out a fierce, squeaky growl that was more adorable than threatening. Samuel bent down, scooping the little warrior into his arms, feeling the wild, unstoppable thrum of life against his chest. Tomorrow the world might come for them again. Tomorrow they might have to run once more. But tonight they were undefeated. And under the endless canopy of stars, with the future wide open and wild, they dared to dream that maybe, just maybe, they could make this sanctuary permanent. Because sometimes, survival wasn't just about running. Sometimes, survival was about planting your feet in the dirt, raising your voice into the void, and saying, "We are still here." Summer swept through the valley like a quiet revolution, peeling away the last bruises of winter and replacing them with a fierce, unstoppable green. Wildflowers clawed their way up through cracks in the stone. Butterflies stitched the air with silent prayers. The abandoned ranger station, once a battered relic of forgotten days, now thrummed with life so thick you could taste it. And at the heart of it all, 5 bobcat cubs, born from trauma, baptized by fire, tumbled and tumbled through the grass like tiny kings and queens reclaiming a stolen kingdom. Ash, the silver cub with the twisted legs, had grown into a force of nature. His back legs, once a question mark of survival, had strengthened into a unique, bounding gait that was pure defiance made flesh. Watching him hunt, clumsy and glorious, Samuel felt something unspool inside him, a knot of guilt and grief he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. It wasn't just Ash. All the cubs had flourished in their secret haven. The one missing an ear had the fastest sprint of the litter. The one with the scarred back could scale a pine tree faster than Samuel could tie his boots. They had taken every broken thing the world had thrown at them and turned it into armor, into wings. And Willow, dear battle-scarred Willow, watched it all with a queen's pride, her body still marked by old wounds but her spirit a wildfire that no cruelty could ever hope to tame. Samuel didn't just watch. He fought too. With Claire's help, he filed legal petitions, worked endless hours documenting their case, and rallied local conservationists in secret meetings, whispered through coffee-stained maps and backdoor deals. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about drawing a line in the sand so thick the world would trip over it. And finally, after months of fighting battles no one but them could see, Samuel stood before a small courtroom packed with weathered faces and skeptical officials and said the words he had carried like a torch through every dark night. "They are not property. They are family, and no one will ever own them again." The judge's gavel came down with a final, echoing crack. Pine Hollow Valley was declared a protected wildlife sanctuary, federally recognized and permanently shielded from private ownership or development. It didn't erase the scars. It didn't bring back the one Samuel had lost along the way. But it mattered. Oh, it mattered. The news spread like wildfire. Not just about the sanctuary, but about Willow's journey, about her cubs, about the quiet, relentless fight for life that so many had dismissed as just another lost cause. Articles flooded the internet. Wildlife foundations reached out. Donations trickled in from strangers moved to tears by a story they never knew they needed. Schools taught lessons on resilience using photos of Willow and Ash bounding through the wild grass. A children's book about their survival hit bestseller lists without a single marketing dollar spent. And somewhere, in living rooms and classrooms and hospital beds across the country, people whispered the same words. If they can survive, so can we. On the last day of summer, Samuel stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Willow and her grown cubs vanish into the endless green. They didn't need cages. They didn't need fences. They needed only the freedom they had fought for with every heartbeat. Willow paused once at the tree line, her golden eyes finding Samuel one last time. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a thank you. And then they were gone, swallowed by the wild they were born to rule. Samuel stood there long after the forest swallowed them whole, feeling the sun warm his face, feeling the earth hum beneath his boots. Claire nudged him gently, a grin playing on her lips. So, she said, what's next? Samuel smiled, a real smile, the kind that didn't carry a shadow behind it. Whatever it is, he said, we're ready. Because in a world that tried every day to break the brave, sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply keep loving. And against all odds, against every scar and storm, love had won.